Good morning, everyone. It's a great pleasure for me to be here with you to talk about frugal innovation, which is also the topic of my new book that just got published by the Economist a few weeks ago. So I thought it's better to kind of begin with some kind of background on what is this concept called frugal innovation and trace its origins a bit, which in a way connects to my own professional development path. I've been a management consultant to companies in the US and Europe for about 15 years. And about 10 years ago, we began to hear some interesting comments from senior executives in companies that we consulted. They begin to note a couple of things about the innovation model. The first one is that innovation is becoming more and more expensive. As you may know, it costs a lot of R&D money to do innovation, to the point where last year alone, PwC estimates the large companies in the world spent about $647 billion in R&D. So the first thing is that it costs more money to do R&D. That's the first thing. The second issue is that R&D is also becoming more resource intensive. If you look at areas like apparel industry, electronics, it takes a lot of resources, natural resources, to make these items. For example, it's nice to have latest fashionable jean, but it costs about 10,000 liters of water to produce one pair of jeans. Or you take Kingfisher, which is Europe's largest home improvement retailer. They consume the wood, which is the equivalent of a mini forest the size of Switzerland every year. So clearly, natural resources are required as well to come up with the latest and fanciest products as well. And we know that natural resources are dwindling as well. The third factor is that most companies are telling us that actually they're having trouble not just inventing ideas, but actually commercializing them. And one of the reasons is because these companies are stuck in very rigid processes that prevent them from innovating very, very quickly. And this is a nice quote from Beth Comstock, the CMO of General Electric, who says, "We are not innovating fast enough, and we need to systematize change." So there's a need for speed as well, which is increasing in large companies. And then the next important phenomenon that we don't talk about is that latest and fanciest innovation is great, but the real question is it really what we call trickle down so that benefits the entire society? Not really sure. Take financial services sector that invests in amazing technologies every year in terms of mobile tools, etc. But the fact is that 68 million Americans, that's about 1/5 of the US population today, is underbanked. They don't have access to the kind of full gamut of financial services we take for granted, like debit card, credit card, or a saving account. So clearly there is some problem with innovation because on one hand it's becoming costlier, more resource intensive, and yet is not benefiting everyone. So we told ourselves we need to look for a new model of innovation somewhere in the world that will be less costly, more eco-friendly, more flexible, and then more inclusive. So we told ourselves, where can we look and find this new model? Well, we said, let's go to these emerging markets like India, China, Africa, and Brazil, because they are growing very quickly. As you can see, over the last 10 years, they're outpacing the Western world in terms of economic growth. So when we went to the emerging markets and we began to look at how innovators, entrepreneurs actually innovate, we discovered that they have a very unique mindset. Let me give you one example of such entrepreneur. Mansukh Prajapati is a porter by training who actually invented the world's greenest fridge. It's called Mithikul. It consumes no electricity, is made entirely of clay, and can consume food and food vegetables for about 5 days. And this is a boon for a country like India, where 700 million people live off the electricity grid. So the first thing we notice among these entrepreneurs in emerging markets is that they have this amazing ability to turn constraints into an opportunity, okay? In particular, resource constraints. So let's look at another example of an innovation that illustrates this kind of resilient mindset. This is in Peru, a country that has a 95% humidity rate and only receives 1 inch of rainfall every year. A local engineering college invented this giant advertising billboard that absorbs humidity in the air, condenses it, purifies it, and then generates over 90 liters of drinkable water every day. Okay? So they take what is abundant, humidity, to address what is scarce, which is lack of water. And now what we begin to see is that you have amazing innovators in emerging markets who are using this kind of frugal ingenuity to begin to deliver services on a larger scale in areas like healthcare, education, energy, for example, and finance in emerging markets. So this is Dr. David Chetty. He's a cardiologist who was a personal surgeon of Mother Teresa. And today he operates a giant health city in the southern India where he can perform a heart surgery for $3,000. Whereas in the US, it costs about $50,000. Okay? And he does that as a charity. That means everybody pays. Even the poorest people can avail the service except they pay using a micropayment model. Okay? So this is not philanthropy. This is a for-profit model that is also inclusive. And then the biggest kind of continent in the world, I think that's going to teach us a lot about this kind of frugal innovation is Africa. It's a country where we have two interesting phenomena, and I think there have been many of you, I heard are mobile experts, so you like the statistics. 80% of Africa is underbanked. They don't have bank account. They don't have access to electricity. They don't have access to many services or bank account, of course. But 80% of Africans have a mobile phone. So what you begin to see is that mobile connectivity is becoming the foundation for delivering all kind of services that we have in the West, whether it's banking services, energy, education, healthcare, you name it. So this is M-Pesa. You might have heard about it in Kenya, which is a mobile service that enables half the population to send, receive money using their mobile phone without having a bank account, 50% of the country's GDP is transacted to the service. So what happens is that like a mobile Android, whichever one you want to use, again, a platform. Once you have a platform like Android, iPhone, then you can start plugging apps on top of that. So now what's happening is that this telephony platform is enabling Kenyans and rest of Africa to avail other kind of services, not just products that we take for granted, but basic services like solar energy. Now they can buy this kit for a few dollars. It's called M-Copa. It's a home solar system. And this allows them essentially to get solar energy on a pay-as-you-go basis. So they just make a micropayment daily. And as long as they make micropayment, they can have access to the system. And you might have heard yesterday that in Tanzania, the government decided to leapfrog from candlelight, which is the main source of energy, to solar light by installing this kind of solution to 1 million houses in 2017. So what Africa is teaching us that they're going to leapfrog directly from traditional banking to mobile banking, from candlelight to solar light, okay? Using, among other things, mobile connectivity. So we wrote our first book, on this concept of frugal innovation or frugal science, because we noticed that even in a scientific world, this kind of frugality can be useful. As a case in point, this is a mission, a spatial mission launched by NASA called the MAVEN for Mars. And this satellite actually entered Mars orbit on the 22nd of September last year. 2 days later, India's own space mission was completed when Mangalyaan, their own satellite, entered Mars orbit. The difference is that they carried out this project 10 times cheaper than NASA and 3 times faster by essentially doing a lot more software simulation, for example, instead of making physical prototypes and things like that. Okay? So this is called frugal science. It's basically a cost-effective way of conducting scientific experiments and space exploration as well. So we actually wrote a book on it about 2 years ago called Frugal Innovation. And Jugaad is a Hindi word, means an improvised fix, a kind of a MacGyver kind of spirit of innovating with very limited resources. And then after that, we begin to notice that actually, wait a second, this kind of frugal innovation becomes more and more relevant in the Western world as well. Why is that? Because first of all, since the economic recession began in 2008, we begin to see more frugal behavior among consumers in the US and Europe. Today, the top 10% richest Americans account for about 60% consumer spending in America. Wages are stagnating, and that means the middle class Americans and Europeans are looking for more value for the limited money they're willing to spend. So as a result, you begin to see some what we call permanently value-conscious behavior, like people seeking discounts more and more, or people looking for private labels instead of brands. And then more importantly, there is a frugal kind of lifestyle that people are choosing by saying, I want to live with less, not because I'm constrained to do it, because I want to do that way. Okay? So this is the first thing, is that consumers are becoming more value conscious. But the real more important trend is that consumers are becoming values conscious as well. And this is a global study done by Nielsen that shows that 55% consumers are willing to pay even extra money for brands from companies that are socially and environmentally responsible. And 2/3 of people around the world want to work for companies that actually are socially and environmentally responsible as well. So it means that they're not just seeking more value for money, but they're looking for more values as well from brands. So as a result, we might say, well, what does it mean for big companies? Well, we'll come to that in a moment. But what is exciting is that this is leading actually consumers to turn into what we call prosumers. It's basically a play in words between producer and consumer. That means that they're not passive users of goods and services. They become active producers of goods and services or value creators themselves. Okay? And this is actually enabled by sharing goods and services among consumers themselves, which is the sharing economy. And sometimes consumers making their own products, which is the maker movement we'll talk about as well. And overall, these are becoming the two pillars of what I call the frugal economy. And a frugal economy is, in a nutshell, an economy where supply can meet demand in a cost-effective, environmentally friendly way. Okay? So this is actually enabled, as I said, by the sharing economy, which is the kind of first pillar of this. And this is something, as you know, it's about Airbnb, it's about car sharing, and this is actually exploding. As a matter of fact, this is the most recent study that has been published by PwC that shows that the sharing economy on the B2C side is going to explode from about $13 or $15 billion today to $335 billion, 20 times higher in about 10 years. Okay? Now, this is just the tip of the iceberg, folks. This is the B2C side of sharing. And we'll talk about later what happens if you transpose this model of sharing goods and services and assets to the corporate world in the B2B side. And that's where it's going to get even bigger than this one. Okay? So that's the first trend. The fact that sharing economy is taking off, and it's taking off very, very quickly because of one important factor, is that this is an economy which doesn't require fixed assets. Take example in the hospitality industry. Today, Airbnb has become the 5th largest hotel chain in the world without owning a single hotel. So in the balance sheet, there's no fixed assets. Not only that, they can keep expanding very, very quickly. The scaling up is very seamless. So this is Brian Chesky, the CEO, who says provocatively that Marriott is planning to add 30,000 rooms in 2014. We will do that in 2 weeks. Okay? So it's a rapid scale up as well, which makes it very threatening for established companies. So this is not a sharing economy. The second movement, of course, you know very well, is the maker movement, which allows essentially everyday citizens to essentially come up with their own technical devices, technology devices. They make something that in the garage or in the kitchen table, and there was no venue where they could actually showcase their MacGyver inventions. And that's where the Maker Faire began, as you know, in San Mateo, where I live, on the left side, and then eventually is now popping up in every city around the world. Every mayor of every city wants to host this now. It took place in Rome 2 years ago, in Paris, and I think it's popping up everywhere. People call this the TEDx for thinkers. TED is for thinkers, Maker Faire is for thinkers. Okay? And to the point where this is becoming so strategic is because you begin to see some of the building blocks that are powering this maker revolution. And this is the open source hardware movement. Whether it's the Raspberry Pi that you know very well, which is a $30 personal computer the size of a credit card, invented by Cambridge University, which is revolutionizing computing. And this is today downloaded over 5 million units have been sold already, okay? And making it the fastest selling personal computer in the world. On the right-hand side is a single board microcontroller, Arduino, also an open source hardware, which allows you to create devices that can control and interact with the physical environment using sensors and actuators. Over 1 million units sold already. So these are becoming essentially the building blocks of the maker revolution. And to the point where President Obama actually even hosted, I'm going to go to the next slide, even hosted an event at the White House in June last year, which was the first Maker Faire at the White House. And he said very interestingly that today's DIY, do-it-yourself, is tomorrow's made in America. Okay? So in other words, the maker movement is assuming more and more strategic relevance as well because, and I apologize, I'm going to go back to the previous slides, this one. Why? Because now you begin to have amazing platforms where people can go and come up with not just some, small inventions for personal purpose, but they could actually start making companies out of it. And this is places like tech shops or fab labs that are opening up in major cities around the world, where people have access now to cutting-edge industrial tooling equipment and things like, 3D printers. Of course, in these pictures, you might say, well, we see some people, tinkering and coming up some interesting, solutions for the personal use. But you can actually start disrupting industries from this platform. And this is what happened with the Square, which is turning now every mobile phone into a mobile payment device. And this actually was prototyped and invented in a tech shop in San Mateo, okay, in the West Coast. And today it transacts over $30 billion in payments. Okay? So this is the point, is that the cost of innovation is going down. That means the barriers to entry are lowering as well. And this is why, as I said, again, President Obama kind of highlighted this as being very, very important. He even has a senior advisor now in the White House to advise him how the maker movement can become a very important economic force in coming years. So interestingly, I was the advisor on a documentary film called The Maker that I recommend you to see, which actually documents exactly how this maker movement is revolutionizing the society and the economy in the Western world. And I have to say, interestingly, I assisted in the premiere of it in your Mountain View headquarters a couple of months ago. And I had the pleasure to even visit your makerspace in Mountain View called the Garage. I don't know if you have one here in London, but this would be interesting to think about as well, like, how to create a kind of makerspace as well across, Google campuses to promote the spirit of, making as well. So what I want to transition now is to show actually how some entrepreneurs are using this kind of, frugal innovation kind of mindset to create solutions that are not just fun or interesting and sexy, but actually to solve real problems in healthcare, education, and finance and farming, etc. So let me give 3 examples that will really fascinate you, and many of them are in the books as well. The first one is in the healthcare sector. It's called CellScope. They are a Berkeley spin-off. They make an attachment, optical attachment, that you attach to your smartphone, and it converts it into an otoscope. So a mother can insert it in a daughter's ear and see if there's ear infection. She just has to send the video, it's a short video or image, to a doctor, and then within 2 hours, the doctor can send, a diagnostic, if it's a problem or no problem. And if it's a problem, what's the prescription? Okay? And down the road, they can also replace this attachment with another attachment that can convert this device into a dermoscope, so you can check your skin condition at home. So this is called the consumerization of healthcare, which is more and more technology tools using mobile platforms are being given to the consumers so they can take care of the health themselves in a preventive way. Okay? So this is the kind of first revolution you begin to see, which is essentially what I call hardware startups. Right? In Silicon Valley where I live, primarily we have software startups, but you see a plethora of hardware startups coming up as well. So this is in the healthcare sector. If you move on to the farming sector, this is my neighbor, and I have a product with me actually. I will try to check it. It's called G-Tribe. Very fascinating as a background. California is the 5th largest producer of fruit in the world. But we have a huge problem is that water is becoming scarce. And very soon, within 2 years, we are going to have a huge problem in California with water shortage. So farmers in California have a challenge, which is to do more with less. So my neighbor has launched a startup called G-Tribe. So these are wireless sensors designed like a ruler, plastic ruler, and you just essentially stick in different parts of your farming field, and you start collecting detailed information on the soil conditions and ambient environment, like temperature, and luminosity, etc. And it allows essentially farmers to optimize the use of water, energy, and labor, while also increasing their production and the quality of the crops as well, the yields. Okay? And the solution pays for itself within 9 to 11 months. Okay? So very, very interesting. We can maybe take a look at it. So this is what I mean. It's also interesting because the first prototypes they built used Arduino chips. That means that the cost of innovation was quite low at the beginning for them to get it, right? So this is for me the more exciting kind of innovation in the future is like these hardware startups revolutionizing healthcare or farming. There's one more sector I want to touch upon as well, which is directly core to your sector as well. This is a French entrepreneur called Paul Benoit, who has launched an amazing startup called Qarnot Computing, which makes digital radiators. So they have processors inside that actually use the heat generated by these processors is harvested to then heat houses and offices. Okay, so this is an amazing alternative to data centers, which we know are very energy intensive. And today data centers consume 2% of the world's energy consumption, and 50% of the energy utilization data centers is to cool off the servers, because engineers think that heat is a waste you have to get rid of. So this engineer, Paul Benoit, says, no, actually, it's not a waste. Waste can be valorized. We can reuse the waste to do something else. So essentially, it's a distributed computing model, an alternative to centralized data centers. And it turns out that I was very excited. Just before I left my hotel room, this press release just came out. BNP Paribas, which is one of the world's leading banks, just teamed up with a startup to actually take 5% of their risk management computing and transfer it from data centers to their farms, distributed farm. Okay, so this is also kind of, you can call it a frugal computing, which is also eco-friendly way as well of powering the system. So now I want to transition and kind of wrap up with the most important part, which is like how can traditional companies essentially learn to do more with less, in light of the fact that consumers are becoming more value conscious and values conscious as well. You have these entrepreneurs trying to disrupt their industries as well. So this is where the answer to that is essentially to learn to innovate differently. First of all, to innovate in a more frugal way, that means with fewer resources. Secondly, make sure that they come up with affordable and sustainable products to deliver better value to consumers as well. So in other words, do more and better with less. And that's what we call frugal innovation. So in a nutshell, frugal innovation is about, and many of you being engineers, I would be not credible if I don't have a formula somewhere in the slides. So essentially it's about maximizing value while trying to minimize resources. So it's doing that simultaneously, if you like. So the question is value for whom? And so essentially value for, of course, shareholders, we know that, but also for consumers, and more importantly to society at large. And secondly, it's about minimizing resources. Again, what kind of resources we are talking about? Well, naturally financial resources, but also natural resources and time, because time is the scarcest and most valuable resource in our business world. So it's essentially about trying to do more with less, or better with less. So in our book, actually, that you will get a copy here, we actually has identified 6 principles that companies can implement to actually change everything they do in the company, from R&D to manufacturing, sales, and marketing, in order to embed this frugality into the day-to-day activities. I will not bore you with the details of these 6 principles that you can learn from the book, but I want to maybe synthesize all 6 in the form of 4 best practices or 4 key takeaways that I found that would be maybe quite interesting for you to remember. The first one is about developing products that embed 4 key qualities or attributes. The first one is affordability, as I said, because consumers are value conscious. But it's not about low cost, right? Frugal solution is not low cost. It's about making something more affordable, but also 3 other attributes. Make it simpler to use. And I always say, I'm not saying it because I'm Google, but it's like the idea is that Marissa Mayer said very nicely, as I quoted in the first book, it's the user interface of Google, right? Is that when you enter google.com, it's very simple. But behind, you have like billions of algorithms working, right? So the difference is that, as it actually says, it's like a Swiss Army knife with all the tools folded, with a Swiss Army knife with all the tools exposed, which is quite scary. Okay? So this is called complexity, which is you can have simplicity for the user perspective, but the complexity happens in the back office. Okay? So that's a way of thinking about simplicity as well. And then sustainability is important as well, which is a resource-intensive model is not working anymore. And then quality. So that's why something cheap, something doesn't mean it's something shoddy. It has to be good quality as well. So I want to give you some companies who are trying to integrate the 4 dimensions to really disrupt the sectors. The first is from the automobile industry. This is an example from Renault-Nissan, a Japanese car alliance between Renault, the French car maker, and Nissan, the Japanese car maker. In 2005, they launched world's cheapest car, at least in the Western world, called the Logan, which I think may be sold here under the name of Dacia. which has now become the entry-level products for the Renault brand. What is amazing is that initially this product was designed for emerging markets, and it gained a lot of traction in the Western world as well, especially Western Europe. After the economic recession, more and more people now flocked to dealerships to buy these entry-level products, to the point where the sales as part of the total sales revenues of the company was less than 1% in 2005. Today it accounts for over 40% of the company's total revenues. It has become the cash cow for this company. And Dacia is the fastest growing brand in Germany, the country of BMW. Okay. That, as a matter of fact, Volkswagen has announced their own plan to make their own low-cost cars to compete with Renault. And they are not stopping here, Renault. Now they are writing the next chapter in the Frugal Innovation journey, which is going to be unveiled in May in India. This is called CMFA, which is a new car platform which is being developed in India that will be shared between Renault and Nissan, that will enable them jointly to produce next generation cars that will be even more affordable, even more comfortable than what they have had in the past in India. And initially they will be commercialized in the South. That means India, Africa, and South America. And down the road it might even be commercialized in the Western world. So this is an example of combining a good enough quality, as I call it, with affordability and simplicity as well. Of course, when I say frugal product, I talked about not just being affordable, but also being sustainable. That is, using fewer natural resources. And here, Kingfisher, headquartered in the UK, which is Europe's largest home improvement retailer, they are pioneering something called the circular economy, which is a movement launched in the United Kingdom by Dame Ellen MacArthur, which is essentially designing products in an eco-friendly way. So first, in their case, all the products over the next 10 years will use only recycled materials or materials that can be easily renewed. Okay? And then at the end of the life cycle, every product can be disassembled and the raw materials can be reused to make new products in a continuous loop. So nothing goes to landfill. Okay? This is called closed loop innovation, as they call it. So they want to apply these principles of eco-design to their 40,000 products in the portfolio, which is mind-boggling. Okay? So they are not the only one. About 100 other companies are joining this circular economy movement to fundamentally rethink how they design, manufacture, and dispose of the products over time. Then moving on to the next principle, which is equally interesting, is to say, well, it's nice to have one or two products that are frugal and sustainable, but how do you fundamentally rethink your whole supply chain to make it frugal so you can reduce the gap between supply and demand, as I said at the beginning, right? Because the definition of frugal is that you reduce the gap in time and space and resources between supply and demand. Well, today it's not very easy because look at the value chain, right? You have people making products far away from when consumers live in large quantity, mass-produced, ship them over miles of kilometers away from where consumers live, and then people go, drive to, supermarkets to buy them in bulk. So the whole model essentially is very energy intensive and generates a lot of waste. But imagine a new value chain where essentially supply meets demand much closer. Of course, with things like 3D printers, maybe in 10 years, we'll get to reality where we can make our own products. But meanwhile, we need a stepping stone to get there. And this is where I think that what Google is doing, of course, with Project Ara, is actually embody the spirit, right? Because in a way, with the modular phone, you essentially push the production capabilities down to the consumer. The last mile becomes the first mile of the value chain. It's a fundamental revolution, right? So as a result, this modular, phone, I believe, is going to revolutionize also the value chain in the, in the tech industry in a way, because essentially you kind of, produce much closer to customer. And it's also more sustainable because you can selectively replace one of the components that you want to replace. Okay? So now you might say, well, this is interesting because as you can see visually, a cell phone may have about 50 components or less than 100 components, but what about more complex products like a car which has 14,000 components? What about drugs? I mean, like process industry is so complex. How can you make that much closer demand? Well, that's coming as well. Novartis, one of the world's leading pharmaceutical industry, has teamed up for the past 10 years with MIT to pilot, and now they're rolling out in 2017, a new manufacturing technique called continuous production. So continuous production or continuous manufacturing is a way of manufacturing drugs in a micro factory that is no bigger than this. And this micro factory can produce drugs in a continuous mode 10 times faster than larger factories and 50 times cheaper and can reduce carbon emissions by 90%. And literally it can fit in a container and can be shipped to places if there's an epidemic or something where we have to ramp up production very quickly. Okay? So even drug manufacturing industry, we can start bridging the gap between supply and demand. And another example of, I would say, the second kind of best practice is to say, well, it's nice to kind of reinvent your supply chain, but can you reinvent your entire business model to make it more frugal? And here I think there's an amazing example which comes from the healthcare industry, which is pioneered by a health insurance company called AETNA. They are a 160-year-old health insurance company, and they're completely disrupting the US healthcare system by shifting to what is known as a value-based care model. So if you think about why that's revolutionary, because today doctors and providers like hospitals are paid on the number of procedures they do, like how many surgeries they perform, how much medicine they prescribe you, right? But they don't care whether you're getting healthier or not. So the health outcomes is not dependent on them. The value-based care says that we will pay providers, like health insurance companies will say, we will pay you, reimburse you, only if the patient gets better. Okay? So they make them more accountable and also more cost-effective in how they operate. So to make that reality, AETNA is actually disrupting itself, the 160-year business model, to become, as they call it, the Google of healthcare, or the Intel Inside strategy, as they call it, which is essentially to provide the kind of technologies that hospitals need to make the transition to value-based care. And if they make the transition, McKinsey estimates that the US healthcare system can save about $1 trillion in the short term, okay? Because it's so wasteful right now, and this model could create more accountability and more cost effectiveness as well. So that's a very interesting example that you'll find also in the book, where we delve more details about how AETNA is making a shift. Another very disruptive business model transition is Unilever, which is a large consumer good company, which is actually moving to a very eco-friendly business model. Their chairman and CEO, Paul Polman, announced in 2010 the intent to become the world's cleanest and most environmentally sustainable company by doubling revenues by 2020 while reducing environmental impact by 50%, which is a huge task because they are going from 40 billion euro company to 80 billion euro company, at the same time reducing their environmental footprint by 50%, which is a mind-boggling initiative. They're halfway to that transition process. And again, this is a case study from a book as well. The fourth one I want to conclude on, which is my favorite one, kind of best practice, is imagine the sharing economy, as I say, right? Airbnb, we are sharing apartments, we are sharing cars, that's fine. But imagine what happens if companies begin to build collaborative ecosystems where they can start sharing assets and resources. That may sound a bit science fiction, but that's starting to happen. In Scandinavia, this is an eco-industrial park, Kalundborg in Denmark, where about 12 companies are co-located in a park. And essentially, they exchange their waste, production waste, and they share the resources and like energy and information as well. And as a result, they massively reduced the use of water, energy, but also carbon emissions. And this is called industrial symbiosis. That means essentially you operate like nature in a very symbiotic way. Okay? And this is something we'll begin to see more and more. For example, Mars, the chocolate maker, they actually share the distribution truck with rivals in Germany. So the idea is that instead of keeping the trucks idle for a couple of hours a day, why don't we use it to ship other companies' products? Okay? So this is the idea of B2B sharing, which is going to kind of begin to disrupt a lot of sectors as well. But the real exciting part is what if you begin to share your employees with others? What I mean by that is you begin to get your employees to collaborate with other companies' employees. Why you do that? Well, because the best innovations come not by keeping everybody inside the company, but actually by cross-fertilizing ideas. So Ford Motor Company has opened a tech shop in Detroit where they allow their own employees essentially in their spare time to go there and mingle with employees from other companies to get new ideas on how to come up with disruptive solutions. And interestingly, I didn't plan it, some of their upcoming mobile solutions, because with the telematics, are going to come from this place, by the way. This is why, because they're telling to their mobile developers, hey, the software is fine, but you need to test it in real car. So why don't you come here, and you can actually prototype it and test it in a real car, and get very quick feedback. Okay? You can apply lean startup in the real world. Okay? So what happened is that 2 years after they launched this, the number of patentable ideas within Ford has went up by 100% without having to invest more in R&D, which goes back to my first slide. So if you want to innovate more, you don't have to invest more in R&D. You need to give more freedom to employees to tinker. Okay? And this is a model that is going to be expanded. BMW, I believe, is opening their own makerspace in Munich, I believe this month or next month. So this is essentially the B2B side of the maker movement, where essentially companies begin to set up their own makerspace. Okay, so you'll find more case studies, examples in our website, frugalinnovationhub.com. We have gazillions of video testimonials and best practices there. But at this point, I'm happy to entertain some questions from you as well. Thank you. I know it's lunchtime. It's always hard to offer you some food for thought, hopefully. Yes, please.
So what do you see as the main driver for this? Is this going to be somewhat unacceptable? Is this a driver for companies that because it's sort of a recognition that the current model is too much strain on resources, or is it consumer driven?
All three, which is why it's exciting, right? Because it's check, check, check. Of course, to be super blatant, if it's only for the last two you say, save the planet, who cares? I mean, it's important, but for shareholders, not. So this is why it's really innovation, right? Because, or disrupt innovation, because you have to try to make sure that shareholders are happy, because whatever you do as a return for them, at the same time, it makes you look good and do the right thing for the society and planet. And then it's good for the consumers. But you didn't add a fourth one, which I think is very important for you. It's the employees, the future employees. The reason Unilever is doing it, one of the key corporate officers driving their sustainability initiative is the chief HR officer, human resource officer. Because they say, well, the only way we can attract talent in the future is not by giving them bigger salary, by having a moral purpose. That's what I said earlier in the study as well, right? So it's essentially in a way of pleasing shareholders, pleasing activist investors, pleasing consumers, and hopefully attracting a talent as well. Which is why also it's not that easy to do because when you make the transition in a couple of years, you have to reinvent everything in the company. So that involves the cost. That involves the physical, financial cost, involves human cost. So initially, you may take a dip in your sales revenues. So you need to have strong leadership to withstand any pressure you may have, from investors. So that's what's happening with Unilever. Many of the investors are criticizing that the company is caring more for the environment than shareholders. But he thinks, Paul Polman, that is doing the right thing over the long run. Sure.
I wanted to ask you what stops people, but I think you answered your question.
Right.
Now.
Yeah. It's. Yeah, I think you will begin to see that some industries, what happens is that nobody will do it until one company begins to do it. So that's why I gave essentially the example of this bank, which is partnering with Qarnot Computing, right? Banking sector is notorious for it. The moment one company does it, everybody else will follow. So that's why I always say I would rather try to change one company in the industry than try to change the whole industry. So there's going to be the peer pressure effect that's going to kick in very soon. So I think adding to your gentleman's question is that that's the fifth factor. Is if others begin to do it, I need to get going as well. So right now, I would say only, we did some research, I would say only 5% of the largest companies in the world are doing it. But that's enough to begin, to kind of create insecurity in other companies and say, oh my God, are we missing out something, We need to get doing it as well. So other thoughts, questions, or comments or reactions or anything you want? Yes, please.
One of the cited downsides of doing manufacturing in China, for example, is that there is a strong black market of people who will copy the processes and possibly run your factories underground. If you start moving manufacturing closer to consumers, is there a concern that some people only use older manufacturing processes, they won't do the innovation there where there are far more people who could then clone what they see as their important processes?
I think with the open source movement, what you will begin to see is that actually When you operate, I'm going to give you a very specific example that comes to mind, right? I mean, there is some initiatives in France right now around distributed computing, where actually they believe that by sharing more knowledge and having distributed computing model for digital manufacturing, they can accelerate the innovation in the manufacturing process. Because more people involved means that you get more perspective, and this is the whole open source movement, is that actually collectively the whole system gets better, right, and more resilient. Then there's a second part of the question, which is kind of important, is that it also means that a lot of things may be in open source. You might say, well, somebody can grab it and kind of run with it. And there's a very nice statement by the CEO of NanoSatisfy, which launches nano satellites using Arduino chips, which is a mind-boggling initiative, by the way. And he says, look, we use open source technology, and we know that somebody can take it and run with it and build their own thing. But by the time a large company can take an idea from us and actually build a solution, it will take many years. By that time, we'll be light years ahead. So in other words, that's one, the ethos of the startups is that they're much faster. And that means when you're smaller, you're nimbler. That's what I'm trying to say. So that also means that by the time a large company, Goliath, tries to steal something you're doing, but because of the bureaucracy, it will take them so long to actually commercialize it, you'll already be like multiple versions ahead, right? So collectively, it's better to share than to hold. And that's why I say, in 20th century, the people believe that knowledge is power. And today, power is about sharing and finding knowledge. And that's why you come in innocently, by the way. But people ask me, I'm just transitioning. People ask me, what is the role of Google in maker movement, things like that. Well, say, the more you distribute things, guess what happens? There's more friction in the marketplace. There's a more need for discovery of services. Because as long as centralized, this is called the economic theory, right? It's called the theory of cause, which is the idea that the reason you centralize everything is that you know exactly what's happening in the system, right? You have a corporate directory, you can find names and everything. But the moment you distribute it, everything becomes so distributed that you cannot easily find potential partners. So the search becomes super, super, super vital. So I think that this is why I get excited for you, because I think that Google can play a very interesting role by leveraging, I would say, its core, a real essence of what it is, which is search. And think about how we can transpose that in this model to reduce the friction in this frugal economy. If you do that, then the economy becomes even more robust. Other thoughts, reactions, questions? I'll give you a free book if you ask a question. Yeah, sure.
I'm interested in your thoughts on the environment. So you talked about being frugal and making more of a positive impact, such an environment. But a lot of makers, there's a lot of production, and
it consumes more resources, right? Yeah. I have the same thought as you. When 2006, when I started looking at it, at first I was excited. I'm a technologist, so I'm like, it's great. And then yes, I said, wait a second, this is actually creating more, waste or something. And this is the good news. So what's happening is that this is what's going to happen. Next thing is that the first maker movement was more about, I would say, having fun, and it was really about technology-centric kind of movement. But you might see, and it's already happening, the next wave is a more sustainable maker movement, if I can call it that way. So the maker movement is going to go into two dimensions over time, if you think about it. The first dimension is going to become what they call social making. That means before making was an individual act, right? The thinker alone in the garage. Now it's going to become collaborative. So that's the first dimension. That's why the tech shops and things like that. That's also where I think we can talk offline, but where Google can play a big role, which is building the communities around the makers. That's the first dimension. The second dimension is make it more sustainable. So here what's happening is that there are companies now who are beginning to make the 3D printers themselves using recycled components. And then what about the materials you use? Well, there is a whole cottage industry coming up to say, well, what if you use recycled materials to make things? And then once you make the stuff, can you use end of life cycle, these products you make, and bring it back in the cycle? So every principle I talked about in the area of sustainability, you can apply that to the maker movement as well. But beyond that, there is a more convincing argument about the making. And this is, so the 3D printers is what the tip of the iceberg. But underneath, there's a science behind it. And this is called additive manufacturing. This is a whole new way of manufacturing, which the 3D printers use, which is essentially by adding layers of layers, right? Which is much more sustainable than using the traditional way of making things, right? Where you take a big chunk of wood or plastic or metal and you chop off anything you don't need to get what you want, which creates a lot of waste. Here with additive manufacturing, you don't create that waste. Nothing is wasted essentially to the raw materials, right? So that's why the science underneath the maker movement, that is the one is going to be a value-generating area for B2B companies, whether it's a Google or GE or Siemens or IBM. That's where people are going to go after. And in the process, as scale kicks in as well, it will also make it more sustainable over time. So, but it's a very good question because I had the same doubt for a long time. But now I get excited because I can see how, with the social aspect and the social environmental awareness, this could become actually a much more sustainable alternative to traditional manufacturing over time. Yes, please. Judy.
I want to hear a little bit more about the frugal supply chain.
Yes.
Because one example I've seen out there, but I haven't seen it anywhere in the UK or even in the US, I don't know where it is, that is almost the machine you can go to get the book that you want printed. So we're trying to reduce the mass printing of even books
yes.
published. Which I know is not helping your.
yeah, actually it does. Trust me, I will explain why in a moment. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit more about examples that you're seeing in this frugal supply chain?
Yeah. So what Judy is asking is a very profound, idea. Is that essentially we are going to go from just in case manufacturing model or design principle. That means what happens today in design is that, I don't think Google does that, but some of your rivals I know do that, which is essentially just in case design is, let's put all the feature in something, just in case there's a use case that requires the customer to use that feature. And then you end up creating a very bloated system. As a result, the supply chain also gets bloated because you have to plan for all these raw materials you need to make the product possible. So the design is where 70% of the life cycle costs are determined. Okay? So the more you make the design cleaner, simpler, whatever you want to call it, the more you can have downstream impact. So I'm starting with that answer because in the supply chain, design is the first stage in a way. So I call this just-in-case design, which is essentially that you design just for the 70% needs of the customers, and then you incrementally add things. So that directly comes to, let's say, a sector like printing, because one of the problem I have is that it sounds interesting. For example, if I want to update a case study, somebody says, hey, it is a new case study. Well, I have to wait 6 months before the next release comes out. But if I go with the just-in-time writing model, I can create a book where I only have the 6 principles with some, examples, and then I can make it evolutionary. And then you might say, well, that's fine, but you still have to print it. So indeed, yes, there's a big revolution coming in the printing industry. And the same thing like Novartis I talked about, there is 2 companies creating now, I don't know if Google is financing, I forgot, but it's actually micro printing. So this is going to be interesting because this is going to allow bookshops that are dying to actually become printing houses. So why? Because statistics show that, wait a second, 60%, for example, French people have their memoirs, they've already written, sitting in the drawers. They haven't printed yet. Now they can just ship the file to the local bookshop and have it printed. So this is a device that completely creates what you call a high quality kind of book like this with a nice cover, everything, in a small batch. So yes, I mean, this is kind of where we are heading, it's kind of micro manufacturing. And GE, for example, is moving to the next level by partnering with a startup called Local Garages, which makes do-it-yourself cars. Essentially, they're micro factories where you can go and build your own car using open source design. Okay, and they partnered with the Local Garages to create what they call First Build. These are micro factories they want to open around the world, where consumers can come and co-create kitchen appliances. Okay? So essentially, that's something that GE, known for mass manufacturing, realizes that we have to go to the micro manufacturing model. So this is going to absolutely revolutionize, publication industry, appliances, you name it, even drug industry, as I said, in the future. I think initially the motivation will be, cost, but I think it's not just that. I think the bigger factor, and I haven't mentioned that explicitly, is the desire for consumers to create themselves things and have personalized items. And because this is called the IKEA effect, if you Google, you will find some TED Talks on that. 70% consumers will keep products longer if they were involved in the creation of it. So this is kind of why this is a real profound values that is going to accelerate the development of micro manufacturing. Other thoughts, questions? Sure. No, it's actually a good point. I actually, far from it. I mean, everybody's rebelling against it because you can think about how disruptive it is for some incumbents. But it's an interesting way to answer your questions, like not companies rebelling, but companies, investors rebelling. Case in point, AETNA, the health insurance company, their CEO, when I interviewed him, Mark Bertolini, was saying that, the investors are not very happy he's making this shift because they are sitting on a lot of cash, double-digit margins. They keep signing more patients as customers. Life insurance they're selling. So why change? So he says, well, very simple, and I'm rephrasing what he said from the book. He says, well, because if you keep running on the track we're running, in 5 years there's no more track left. So we might as well forfeit the race. So that means that we have to proactively begin to shift. And that's where pushback begins, because whether it's senior management in the company or investors, they're like, why you want to change the model that is working very well, right? So that's why it takes a lot more guts, for senior management to say, well, everything's going well right now, but in 5 years the drug industry won't be like this. So you have to see something others don't see, and then stick to it. And the next step is to really impart that vision to everybody in the company, so they believe in what you see as well. And that takes time. So the rebellion, will happen within, of course, but also from the, investors as well. But I think that if customers are going to ask for it, and you're not going to attract the right employees in the future, I think those are factors strong enough to get any company to change. At one point, you have to, realize that investors are powerful, but they're not the only ones you have to listen to. So, sure.
Why do you think that additive manufacturing is going to decentralize the production? When I see it,
sure.
Especially with increasing efficiency of logistics, we see nowadays, it's still going to be a domain of large big companies.
Yes. So additive manufacturing initially will be led by, GEs, Siemens of the world, right? Building like, big factories. And what they're looking at essentially, can we take the additive manufacturing process and bring it not to make, large-scale production in big factories, but embed them in these micro factories I talked about earlier. So that won't happen overnight. So I agree with you. It will be like, a couple of years before we can transition to this kind of, micro factory model of additive, manufacturing. But in the short term, it's to first create a proof of concept to see if it can be done even on large scale, and then eventually it will, be brought to micro factories over time. But it will be absolutely led by large companies who have the wherewithal in terms of, science and technology, development capabilities. That's why GE is looking into it. Siemens looking at it. I can't name some other companies, but at least 7 to 8 large companies from the industrial world and also from the IT technology world who are looking at, how to revolutionize additive manufacturing. So my hope is that as more large companies jump into it, that will create more innovation to make it, much more accessible, in terms of, bringing it down in scale, so it can be embedded, in a micro factory. And it won't happen, I would say, in the next 5 years, but over 10, 15 years, it will happen. So. Great. So I think we've come to top of the hour. So thank you very much for your interest, and you can grab a book on the way out. And thanks a lot. Thank you.